Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Extensions Academy. In this video, we will talk about how to do a capture, and we'll start with the simplest material, that's pawn. So consider this position, and let's say you are in a game and your pawns are structured in such a way for black and white. As you can see, when the pawns get into an exposure, which means they are facing or coming in close contact to each other in a square, so pawns capture diagonally. What I mean by that is this pawn has an ability to capture this pawn diagonally, or it could capture this pawn. And likewise, black can also do the same. Black pawn in this square can capture the white pawn, or this pawn can capture this. So my chances are I can capture as white and capture this pawn, which means I will move the pawn onto the square and displacing the piece. So in this case, if I want to capture this pawn on the left, I would go this way. And similarly, black has now an opportunity to capture back. So this pawn can take this pawn and you can place the pawn outside the board. Now let's say, take a look at this pawn. If it is white to play, white could obviously make a choice if I want to capture this pawn or this pawn. But if it's black to play, black could also do the same. It could actually capture this way, or it could capture diagonally this way. Now, if white were to capture the pawn, the good news is the pawn was backed up or supported. We have a concept called support in chess. For instance, this pawn is supporting this pawn. So it's a forward pawn here, and this is the base pawn. And base pawn always supports the forward pawn. So in this case earlier, as you know, I was going to capture this pawn, but then this pawn is supported by the backward pawn, which means if I capture, the pawn could capture it back. Let's take a look in this position where maybe black want to capture this pawn. And by now you may have guessed it, white was supporting that pawn, so white gets a chance to capture back. Now what happens to, let's say this pawn moves up. These pawns are stuck. In other words, they are sort of like hit a wall. They cannot run into a wall, so there's no more moves left. You would have to make other moves. So you still have a possibility to move this pawn. So now these pawns are stuck too, just like these pawns. So the game can only happen in rest of the board. So let's say I move this pawn. Now these pawns are stuck too, just like them. So giving you further limitation on having, you can move the game on to these two pawns. Based on whichever pawn you move, it comes into close contact for a diagonal capture. Let's say if I was moving this pawn, then the capture would go in this direction, or vice versa. So let's say black played this. White has a choice. Either it can capture the pawn, or it could simply move the pawn, and then you again are stuck in this position. So this would qualify to be a draw because no pieces can move or pass by without, and there's no capture permitted, and there are no other moves left on the board. So this is how pawns capture. One more time. Let's say if I have 3 pawns put in this way, and black has 3 pawns put in this way, I could capture this pawn diagonally and black could capture this pawn diagonally. And let's say if I move my pawn 2 steps, then black could capture this pawn and I could capture this pawn. So finally, white pawns go diagonally in order to capture a opponent's pawn. So that means white pawn could potentially capture one of these 2 pawns. And if it was black pawn trying to capture this pawn, And if white had two pawns backing up, that means these two pawns are actually supporting the white pawn. And what does that do is, if you capture this pawn, now I could capture back this way, or I could capture back this way. And if black pawn captures, then white can go back further capturing. So this is how pawns get captured. Let's take a look at bishop and how it could capture a pawn. So let's say white has a bishop here, and there are black pawns lined up in a random order. And imagine these pawns are going up this direction. So if white bishop needs to capture these pawns, it could probably try capturing the first pawn that's nearby, but the challenge is this pawn is backed up or supported by this pawn. The base pawn is supporting the forward pawn. It depends on the direction of the board where the pawns are going. You decide which is the forward pawn and which is the backward pawn. So always remember, bishop cannot, or any piece cannot capture the forward pawn because the base pawn will capture it back. So in this case, you will have to go back one step so that you could capture the base pawn first. And then again, you decide, can I go this way or capture this pawn? So probably this pawn on the right is hanging because it doesn't have a support, whereas the left pawn is backed up by this pawn. So you may end up losing the bishop because pawn can capture back. So you better capture the hanging pawn or the non-supported pawn. And then later when your next turn comes, you could go back and slowly capture this pawn in order to capture this. So I hope you have learned how to capture a pawn, bishop versus a pawn. So whenever a pawn comes in the diagonal of the bishop, it could capture. And it doesn't have to be a pawn. It can also be a knight or any piece for that matter that comes in the diagonal path of bishop can capture. So in this case, we would have to capture the rook first and wait for black's turn. And let's say if black leaves the knight behind, bishop can capture the knight. So that's how bishops capture. Let's take an example of knight. And I'm going to keep a few pieces that knight can capture. So in this case, the knight can capture the pawn. And let's say black played some move, then white can capture the queen. And then again, black played some move, then white could capture in its next turn the rook. So logic is simple. The knight or the piece can capture anything that's on its way. But one thing that you cannot capture is, let's say in this position, you can only capture the piece that's on the landing position. So this knight, its landing position square is this, or maybe this, or this, or this, or this. These are the L-shaped squares where it can land. So as you can imagine, this knight can capture the bishop, but it certainly cannot do anything to the rook, even if it's jumping over it or it's in the path of the L. So the rule is knight can displace only the landing square piece. So in this case, knight can capture the bishop and the bishop goes out of the board. You won the bishop technically. Now, if there was a pawn here, and if there was a bishop here, and if you look at the new L formed, you could actually capture the pawn, but you cannot capture the bishop because it's in the way. It has to be on the landing square. So in this case, you can capture the pawn. And now, as you can see, it does fall on the landing square, the rook. So now knight can capture the rook. And if it needs to capture the bishop, it has to go back to a square where it can come back as L and then further capture it. So that's how the knights capture. Let's take a look at how rooks can capture. Placing a rook here. Let me put a knight, probably a bishop, and then queen. So let's say if it's white to play, white could easily go and grab this knight because it's on its path, on its way. But in real game, the knight was supported by the queen, so you may not want to do that because then queen can capture it back. But for our demonstration purpose here, let's say black had to play some other move, then rook could continue further capturing the bishop on its way, and then finally in the next turn it would capture the queen on its way. Now sometimes, let's say if there was a connected pawn, in this case, this is the connected pawn, rook, and these pawns, imagine if they're coming downward, so this direction. So rook cannot capture this pawn because this is not a base pawn. It's been backed up by this pawn. So this is the base pawn. So you need to attack the base pawn first, capture it. Now you have to make a plan. Either you come this way or this way, and then you decide to capture the next base pawn. Then again, you can go this way or this way, and you decide to capture the final pawn. Let's take a look at another piece, probably queen. And I'm going to put just pieces of opponent in the path of the queen. So let's say, yeah. So I can take the rook first because it was in the diagonal. Now I have no other pieces in the contact of the queen. So obviously I have to move the queen first to a spot that it can attack one piece. So maybe I can go here and then capture the knight in the next move. And then probably I have to come closer to the pawn or the bishop and then capture the bishop. And now it's in my path. So I can go diagonally and capture this pawn. Again, the capture rules apply if a piece, and let's say this pawn is going up. So that means this pawn is also supporting the bishop. In this case, queen, it's not recommended to capture the bishop because you would simply be captured back by the pawn and you lose a queen for a bishop. Remember, queen is 9 points and bishop is only 3 points. So you lose 6 points, 9 minus 3, 6 points. And that is a loss. It's not for your profit. So you would not want to do that. So let's take a look at the last piece, that's king, and how it can capture a pawn. And I'm going to set this position in this way. There are 2 pawns versus the king. So the only way you can capture these pawns is, just like I said in the previous positions, you have to go to the base pawn first, which is supporting this pawn. Imagining these pawns are coming in this direction. So I have to first capture the base pawn. And in the next move, black plays something. And then as white, you could capture the next pawn. So king can also go in any direction, but you just need to make sure that the pawn that you're trying to capture is not supported and it's the base pawn, then you can capture it. One other thing to notice about the king is, let's say this pawn is here and it's coming in this direction downward. So king cannot really go in front of the pawn in this square because the pawn is controlling these 2 squares, as you know. So king cannot move to this square because it's considered to be in check. Check is a situation where a piece is attacking the king. So in this case, if king moves here, the pawn is checking the king. In other words, it's guarding that square, making it an illegal move for white king to move. So the only way to reach to this pawn is either it can go this way, and this is not a check position, so it's fine, or you could go in a longer way. So you could go this way and then attack the pawn. So that's all for this video. I hope you understood how the pieces work in terms of capture. Again, the fundamental principle of capture is you have to look if the piece that you're trying to capture, if it's under any support, which means is it backed up by anything behind or sideways. So if I were the king capturing here the pawn, black's pawn, I need to make sure if this pawn is hanging independently, or if it has a rook supporting perhaps, or it has a bishop behind that supporting the pawn, or it could be simply even a pawn, a base pawn supporting this pawn. So you need to calculate and see if this pawn was truly supported or not supported. And if it's hanging, which means it's not supported, then you could go ahead and capture the pawn. So that's all for this video. If you have time, please join me in the next video. Thank you.